So this is the second in a series of 3 videos that I'm making on how to put together an after-dinner speech. And my students have to get used to, when I teach, I use a lot of analogies. There are 2 analogies you're going to hear a lot about in this, and the first one is an analogy to food and to cooking, and the second one is an analogy to music. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of material you're trying to generate, how they aren't jokes, they're something different. And then I'm going to talk about the process by which you can do it, and along the way I'm going to talk about some of the ingredients that go into that process. So I'm kind of doing a recipe backwards. I'm doing the preparation, then what goes into it. And then finally I'll talk about how this fits together with the whole speech writing process. So to begin with, one of the things that I have to affirm in every single video is a lot of this is about how to write a stand-up routine. And after-dinner speaking is not stand-up comedy. After-dinner speaking is a platform speech. But the process by which you create a stand-up routine gives you exactly the kind of material that fits into an after-dinner speech. It's just that a comedian will try to put together that kind of material for 10 or 15 minutes and just arrange it until it flows, whereas someone who's writing an after-dinner speech is going to generate that material but also generate a platform speech and then braid them together to where they are woven in and out, and you're never fully one or the other, and they fit together. So the first thing that you have to understand, a lot of people's very simple understanding of an after-dinner speech is they think it's a platform speech with jokes, and it's not. They are not jokes. You gotta understand the difference between a joke and a bit. Now, this past spring, when I was teaching advanced public speaking and I had assigned them to put together a stand-up comedy routine, I illustrated this the first day by having a little conversation with one of the class members who was also on my forensics team, Preston. And Preston is also a musician. He's graduated since then and he's currently out touring with his band, Ergo Rex. And I asked him that first day, I said, do you think you could sit down at your piano and you could compose a ringtone? And he thought about it a second and he said, sure, they're only 3 or 4 seconds long and they just have to get your attention and sound nice. I could do that. And I said, do you think you could compose 5 or 6? Yeah, it'd be boring, but I could do it. And I said, now imagine, very weird question, imagine you got a gig where you needed an hour-long set. Do you think you could string together ringtones and just play one ringtone after another for a whole hour? And he said, I could, but I don't know why I ever would. And I said, tell me why not? And he said, well, first of all, trying to put together a whole hour of music out of little 3 and 4 second long blocks, that would be a ridiculous amount of work. And secondly, even if I did it, even if I wanted to put that much work into it, the audience would hate it because they would never have a chance to get into it. We would change what we were doing every few seconds. And if you get those 2 things, then you get the difference between a joke and a bit. A joke is completely detached from context. The way jokes work, you hear a good joke and you can walk up to someone, you can tell them the joke. It doesn't require any context leading up to it, and it doesn't require anything to happen after the big reveal of the punchline. Bits are not like that. Bits are more like the parts of a song. So a song can have a hook, it can have verses and a pre-chorus and a chorus and a bridge and an instrumental break and an outro, and all of those can be somewhat distinct from one another, recognizably distinct. You can analyze the song and pull them all apart, but they have to blend together. And someone who's going to do either a stand-up comedy routine or an after-dinner speech that's going to go on for several minutes needs bits. They need bits that harmonize. They need for the bits to support one another, set one another up. So, how is it that you come to have bits that work together? Here's the way you do it. Well, the first thing I should tell you is, when I taught the stand-up comedy class back in the fall 2011 term, this is the textbook I adopted. The Stand-Up Comedy, the book by Judy Carter. Now, I'll warn you that it is not a very clean book. A lot of the example jokes in it are sexually explicit. A lot are tasteless. But the process she walks her readers through for how you can go from having no material at all to having your first stand-up comedy set, she does a really good job explaining it. So I looked at half a dozen books and settled on hers. And we used it, and it actually went quite well. Everybody in the class wound up with a serviceable routine. Not everybody's equal in quality, but not everybody is equal in talent. So I am going to give you the basics of that as a method of creating the original comic bits to go in your after dinner speech. Now, you start with a blank piece of paper, and the first thing you do is you write down the things that are unique about you, because those things can wind up providing a very good bedrock for your after dinner speech. So you start visible. Are you an unusual height? Are you unusually tall? Are you unusually short? Do you have strange color hair, or a lot of hair, or very striking looking hair? Is there something about your face that people notice right away? Is there something about your shape, your body shape? And I can give you two examples of this at two opposite ends of the spectrum. I talked in my previous video about Brian, and Brian was AFA national champion for after dinner speaking. His speech was on the supersize effect, and he talked about how fast food restaurants, you can supersize your order, and you can go to Sam's and Costco and get these gigantic portions of consumer goods that at a supermarket you get a much smaller portion of. And that was the theme running all the way through the speech. Well, Brian was very, very large, and I don't mean linebacker large, I mean he was obese. He was easily over 200 pounds, and I'm pretty sure he was probably over 300 pounds. Had a very large chin, had a very round body. And so a lot of these bits having to do with things being so large, people would look at him and it would actually heighten the tension a little bit, the whole emotional release theory of humor, that it was almost as though this was all being mocked by a person who was the target of the mockery himself. And then at the other end of the spectrum, one of the students who was in the stand-up comedy class named Brandon. Brandon is very, very, very thin. I mean, think of the thinnest person you've ever seen, and Brandon's probably half that size. And he did his stand-up routine about his experience having worked as a security guard at Target. And he had a lot of jokes in there about how he's not very intimidating looking. And there was one, I'm not going to be able to do it justice. I can't remember how he worded it. But he talked about stalking a shoplifter, and the shoplifter all of a sudden turned the direction he was. And so he said, and then I turned sideways, and I was invisible. And that just got this huge laugh. And he got that from starting about the things that people could tell just by looking at him. The second thing that you might write down on your piece of paper, things that are unique about you. Are you from an unusual part of the world? Do you have a very large family? Do you have a talent nobody knows about? Things like that where you can tell the audience at the very beginning, near the beginning of your presentation, and then you can use it. And because it tickles them and catches them off guard, and they then think of you as someone who's unusual, that becomes kind of a good fulcrum for the leverage of your comic bits that follow. From there, what Judy Carter says you should do is you should write down things that worry you, things you're afraid of, things that anger you. As a matter of fact, it's not a bad exercise if you were to pause the video right here to write down 3 of each. 3 things that worry you, 3 things you're afraid of, 3 things you get angry about. Because you will probably wind up using one of those as your topic. So then, what you do is you begin to talk about them. Take each one in turn, or there may be one that jumps out at you and you think, after having heard about all of this process, there's one that you think, this is going to be perfect. If you hit kind of a dead end and it's not working right, you can switch to one of the other topics on your list. But however you do it, take one of them and you start talking about it. You don't need another person around. You just need to record it, because you're going to talk and talk and talk until you have run out of words, until it feels like you're straining to think of anything else to say. You have got to ramble until you are tired of talking, until you feel almost groggy, until it's the kind of talking you do when you've pulled an all-nighter and you're not even really making sense to yourself anymore. And so, you're forensics people. Presumably, you can keep pulling words out of your head forever and ever and ever, but let's say you were going to talk about spiders, because spiders scare you, and you were going to talk about different kinds of spiders, and spiders are poisonous, and spiders are creepy when they run, and spiders make me think of octopuses, and spiders, there's the itsy bitsy spider, and they're so itsy bitsy it could crawl through the cracks in the doors and get to you even if you tried to lock it out, and just on and on and on you go. And the more tired you get of talking about it, the more you'll start to say things that are strange. When you go back and you listen to it, you pick the parts where you started to get strange and you type them out. And then Judy Carter says you need a comedy buddy. What I have found is it works even better when you've got a group, because those parts where you were saying something strange, they'll be just the little turns, the little points in everything you were saying when you say something really strange, and you know that's got potential. And then Your comedy buddy or your editing group will then try to punch it up. They take it and make it even more weird. They take it and put a hard twist on it to where it's the kind of thing that's going to startle people into laughing. I can give you a reasonably good example of this. Mark, who I talked about in the previous video, he was in the stand-up comedy class, and when we wound up doing the showcase and the audience voted, they said that his was the funniest of all. And the first part of his stand-up routine was about lines and how he hated to wait in line. And he originally came in and he was talking about being behind someone who's had all the way up in the line to look at the menu at, say, the cafeteria or a fast food restaurant or someplace, and only when they get to front of the line do they suddenly discover the menu. And then they have to stand there forever making their decision when he already had decided 15 minutes ago. And he got to that point and he said, I just want to punch them. And someone in the group said, no, you want to bite them. And then someone else in the group said, no, you want to bite them on the face. And it was getting really kind of loud and hostile, but the reason he made it work, and it wound up being a good laugh, and a laugh that he used later on, which I'll explain, was that he did it just completely deadpan. He said, 15 minutes. 15 minutes ago I decided, and now they've just discovered the menu. Makes me want to bite him on the face. So that's the process in a nutshell. Find topics about which you genuinely can get emotional. And then ramble. Ramble until you start to say things that are strange. Then you get together with the people in your editing group, your comedy buddies, take the strange bits and punch them up even more. Now there is actually one more step, I almost forgot, an important step. The basic unit of a comedy presentation is setup, punch, setup, punch, setup, punch. There's the setup, the little bit that they need to be ready, and then there's the punchline. And the punchline, when you first get to rambling, those spots where you sense there's something weird, and then your friends can take the weird bits and turn them into something truly startling, something that's got some powerful incongruity to it, or some powerful emotional release, something with a little bit of a taboo, like biting someone on the face. You're not supposed to do that. Those are the punchlines. What you need to do with the setups is you take the setups and you condense them. You shorten them. Take some of the words out. Play with the wording. Get it to where it's exactly to where it works, to where it hits with maximum effectiveness when the punch comes along. And a lot of times what you want to do is you want for there to be a sharp contrast between the setup and the punch. So the setup sounds completely normal, reasonable, and sane, and then boom, the punchline comes out of nowhere. Let me give you a few bits. I don't make any claim that these are the funniest bits in the history of creation, but they're easily separatable into setup and punch. Here's the first one. Why do therapists have an easier time treating men? Doesn't take as long for them to get back to their childhood. So the setup. Why do therapists have an easier time treating men? So far, sounds reasonable. Men don't have as far to go back to their childhood. And it takes a second before you realize you're saying that men are overgrown children. Once that falls into place, the incongruity is complete, and that's likely to get a laugh from the females in the audience. Second example. I want to die peacefully in my sleep, like my grandfather, not screaming and yelling like the passengers in his car. So the setup, I want to die peacefully in my sleep. Don't we all? Like my grandfather. It's reasonable, your grandfather died peacefully in his sleep. Not yelling and screaming like the passengers in his car. Grandpa obviously fell asleep behind the wheel, and that doesn't fall into place until you hear that part of it, and then the incongruity is complete. It's also got a little bit of taboo because you're laughing at people dying, and you're laughing at an old person driving poorly behind the wheel, which is playing into a stereotype, and you know that you're not supposed to stereotype. Third example. I like going to the park and watching the children run around because they don't know I'm using blanks. And I assume you can see the setup there. Going to the park, watching children run around, that's kind of pleasant. Then you realize that they think they're being shot at, and they just don't know that the bullets aren't going to kill them. Taboo, you shouldn't shoot at children. Incongruity, you didn't see it coming. So, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for setup, punch, setup, punch, setup, punch. There's one last thing to say before I get off into some of the ingredients that will help you arrive at good setup punches. And that is, we said previously that you want to pick topics that have kind of funny emotions attached to them, emotions where it's easy to put on a comic performance. And the easiest emotions to start with, and then you can go off and innovate on your own once you're comfortable doing this, are things that scare you, things that worry you, things that make you angry. But sometimes it's not working. You're not getting anything that's really going to entertain anybody. And what you can do is you can have an insincere and kind of irrational emotional take on your subject matter. So you can take something that you really hate or you really worry about, and then you can do your comedy material as though you love it. So I've had students before put together comedy material about what it's like to be a college student because that worries them. It worries them that they never have any money. It worries them that they never get enough sleep. And then they just sound like they're complaining. And if they have an audience full of college students, who's going to be entertained by that? They don't have any money or get enough sleep either. So they turn it around and they say, I love it. I love never having any money. I love never getting enough sleep. And that by itself is not funny, but you find the twists and you turn them into punchlines. And just the fact that you've started off pretending that this is all wonderful really kind of lays a foundation for it. Another variant on this that Judy Carter talks about is you can take negative features about yourself and you can talk about how proud you are of them. Yeah, I'm a dork, I'm a geek, and I'm proud of it. And then you go into why. All right, so now what I want to talk about is I want to talk about some fairly reliable structural characteristics of comic bits, and you can be on the lookout for those. The first and the most classic one is the rule of three. The rule of three. Three things are funny, especially when the first and the second are completely normal. So the first one establishes the topic. The second one raises the suspense because the audience knows something is coming. And the third one plays the punchline. So let me give you a couple of examples. I talked before about when Brian was in the finals of AFA that there were two other speakers, and one of them was named Sarah. And Sarah had one bit in her speech. Her speech was about how a lot of people who set themselves up as counselors and psychologists really are not qualified and do a lot of damage. And at one point, one of her bits was a lot of these so-called therapists don't have the degrees they need, they don't have their credentials, they don't even have opposable thumbs. So normal, unexpected. One other example that Judy Carter's got in her book, she had one student come to her comedy clinic and wind up with this bit. Well, I'm Arab, so when I shop for a car, I look for the same things that you do. Color, style, how many hostages will fit in the trunk. So when you're taking your ideas, you sometimes might be able to fit them into a rule of three. You might be able to find just a real quick list and make the third one really, really silly. That's one of the things to watch for. A second thing is observational humor. Now, this is something that you'll see done a lot in after-dinner speaking, and most of the time, the observational humor has to do with the unwritten rules that everyone knows you're supposed to do in a forensics event. One example is a lot of times, speakers will make jokes while citing their sources, especially if it's a source everyone's familiar with. So when talking about Brian's final round before, the other speaker that I talked about was Rajani. And Rajani, I was about to start talking about her persona. I'll get to that in a minute. But right at the very beginning of the speech, it was like the second sentence of the speech, she said, "Recently, I was reading an issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which, when I'm feeling a little spunky, I like to call JAMA." And then Brian had a couple in his speech. Because he was talking a lot about grocery stores and consumer goods you can get at grocery stores. At one point, he cited Progressive Grocer. And he stopped and said, where Eleanor Roosevelt shops. And then later on in the speech, he cited the Daily Telegraph. He said, according to the Daily Telegraph, stop! And then went on with the date and went on with the information from it. So little things about what we all do in forensics. A second example that I just remembered, I was judging the semis that same year, and there was a young lady who gave a speech about about decision fatigue, about how hard people find it today to make a decision. And all throughout the speech, anytime she had to walk to show she was moving to a different point, she would suddenly get indecisive about which way to go. And she did the whole thing silently. She would start to turn, and then she would freeze, stop talking, and then look this way and look this way. And then every time she had some kind of gag she did to make up her mind which way to go. So at one point, she pulled a coin out of her pocket and flipped it, and then looked and walked this way. Things like that, riffing on or parodying the things that everybody knows you're supposed to do in forensics. That's something that is a pretty reliable source of material. And I thought of one more. What you do sometimes is you might look for places for a bit that you can put into your speech that's going to help you play with the people in the room. You might find that there's a bit that has to do with very young people, and you might be able to aim a bit at the timekeeper in the room. Or you might find that your judges tend to dress a certain way, and you can have a bit that refers to a particular style of clothing. This one's very, very slightly inappropriate. It's got a reference to STDs in it, but Rajni, when she was giving her speech, she got to the end of the introduction, and then her very first transition to get to the start of her first main point, she had this bit written in advance, and I'm trying to remember the wording of it. She would look around in the room, and she would find someone who had something about them that was visually distinct that she knew she could describe in a few words. In the final round, it was that there was someone sitting in the front row, and this was a classroom, so there were tables, and each table had 2 chairs at it, and there was someone that she knew who was sitting by himself. And so the transition was, cancer patients usually seek chemotherapy, heart patients avoid fatty foods, and those with sexually transmitted diseases usually sit by themselves. And so in another round, she might say, and those with sexually transmitted diseases usually have a pink ribbon in their hair. Something to where when she went in and she was preparing, she had that one little quick throwaway line. If necessary, she could even think up how to complete it on her feet while beginning the speech. So you can look for some of that, and that I would say is an example of observational humor. Something that you're going to find in the immediate environment. Oh, there's one more. There was a student, this was also in Brian's final round, but they had apparently had a sensitivity workshop or something like that in there the day before, and they had not erased the marker board. And when the competitors had come in to write their names on the board, they hadn't erased the whole thing, so a lot of what was up there for the workshop the previous day was still on the whiteboard. So this one speaker, she was giving a speech about poor customer service and some of the solutions that could help us all be better when we're in customer service roles. And she just walks over and she says, finally, we can take some recommendations from the board and be empathetic, emotionally supportive. And it got this huge, huge laugh from the audience because she had noticed it and she had fit it perfectly into her speech. So, observational humor. Some of the things that we do in forensics take one big step back and recognize there is something funny about this. And because everybody in your room, they have in common, their group affiliation is that they are here for a forensics event, and very likely they recognize some of these things, and when you point out how they're a little bit absurd, that's the kind of thing that they're very likely to be kind of warmed up for. It's a little bit of an in-joke, which makes it a little bit pleasing. Okay, so rule of 3, observational humor. A third thing is a callback. A callback. Now, what a callback is, late in your presentation, you make reference to a joke you made earlier. And Judy Carter has an example in her book. Ellen DeGeneres used to have a bit in her routine where she talked about how strange it is that dogs don't like it when you blow in their face. And she said the first thing that they want to do when you get them in the car is they want to hang their head out the window. And then later, much, much later, probably 9 or 10 minutes of stand-up comedy later, she gets down to the end of her routine, and she's talking about her grandmother and how her grandmother is pushy and nosy, and she says, so finally, I just blew in my grandmother's face. And everybody remembered the bit from earlier about the dogs, and it was a big laugh. I'll give you 2 other examples of that. Brian, when he was giving his speech about the supersize effect, he was in his first main point, and he was talking about where the supersize effect came from. He said after World War II, millions of GIs were dumped back into civilian life. One thing led to another, and there was a record bumper crop of babies, followed by 50 years of big, bigger, biggest in everything. Except hotel soap. You know, you're there, you're washing yourself, and it's gone. And that was a fairly big laugh. But then he gets down to the end of the speech, 6 minutes later, hasn't talked about soap in a very long time, and he's talking about a visualization technique. He says, the American Dietetic Association says, for portion control, you should learn what certain portions look like. 3 ounces of meat is equivalent to a deck of cards, or a bar of soap, or 8 hotel bars of soap. And all of a sudden people remember the bit from earlier about soap, bars of soap, hotel bars of soap, and how they're gone. And then one more example. Mark, still giving his speech about how he hates to wait in line, he had talked about, oh gosh, I completely skipped one bit. Well, he talked about how the ultimate line was going to be the line at the Last Judgment to come and be judged before the throne, because it would be every human being who ever lived in all history, all multiple trillions of them. And he had this one bit where he talked about you know, what number, his number would be in line. 30 trillion? Now serving 12? I gotta pee. So he gets to the front of the line, and God is judging him, and he says, "It says here, while in line, you bit someone on the face." So, if you've got a setup, if you've got a good comedy bit at the beginning of your speech, and then you see an opening later on, I wouldn't do this too many times, but once or twice it can be really effective. At the end of the speech, find a way to call back to it. Find a way to remind the audience of it. And then it becomes a thread running through the speech. This is something you'll see a lot of comedians do, and this is something you'll see a lot of people with good ADSs do. A couple of other things. Oh, there's mimicry. If you're going to talk about what it's like to be in a certain interaction, if you're going to talk about what it's like to be at the DMV, don't just describe it. Act out the conversation. Give the other person, the person behind the window, give them a tone of voice and a facial expression, and just use your interp skills for a moment and have the conversation back and forth. And in particular, if you can do imitations. Now, a lot of people get scared off from doing imitations because they can't do a good one, but a bad one can be just as funny as a good one. Mark is my example of this, and this is the bit that I remembered a second ago because he was talking about The Last Judgment, and he said, I really want to watch The Last Judgment, not necessarily just because it's going to glorify God, that's nice too, but because it'll be like the ultimate Judge Judy. And you know nobody watches Judge Judy because they're going to hear lofty jurisprudential wisdom. You tune in to watch Judge Judy lay the smackdown on some fools. And then he tried to do a Judge Judy imitation. I'm a lot smarter than you. And it was terrible, and it made people laugh, and he said, yes, my family is descended from leprechauns. So then, I mentioned that because when he got to the callback, and he's before the throne of God, it says here that, actually, how did he do it? Because he did it in two parts, because I'll tell you what we call that in a moment. He says, it says here you compared me to Judge Judy. And then you bit someone on the face. So he actually had two callbacks in a row, and what a working stand-up comic would call that is a capper. You have an even bigger second joke that you know is going to get an even bigger laugh. So, and that's my example of a capper. At any rate, so that's a callback. Try to find a place late in your speech, late in your presentation, to refer back to a bit that you had early in the speech that you know was pretty good. And, try to use impressions if you can. Use some mimicry if you can. Couple of more structural bits you can put into your speech. One of them that Judy Carter talks about near the very beginning of her book. She talks about it at the same time she's talking about physical traits and unusual traits and what angers, worries, or frightens you. I've found that you don't want to do this until fairly late in the game. Decide if you want a persona. A persona is something that you take on that is behind every single joke, I'm not supposed to call them jokes, every single bit in the entire presentation. You might be too young to remember this particular stand-up comic, but your parents could probably dig some up on YouTube. Rodney Dangerfield. Rodney Dangerfield very definitely had a persona. The persona he had was nobody shows him any respect. And he always looked very nervous. He was always tugging at his collar. Always had big bulging eyes. And that was his persona. He's the one nobody shows any respect. The ADS speaker that was in Brian's final round, Rajni, she had a persona. And it was a great persona. It was probably the funniest thing about her speech. Because she was originally from India. You could tell from looking she was from India. She had dark skin, jet black hair that was straight as a ruler. And she had the reputation from the other events that she did really well in of being very serious and very substantive. So in this speech, she played the seriousness way, way up to play into people's stereotypes about people from India, that they're a little bit too intense and a little too driven and a little too academic. They're the ones who win the National Spelling Bee every year. So she starts off her speech by putting on a stethoscope, and the first words out of her mouth were, "You may call me Dr. Shankar." And then, about 3 minutes into the speech, she says something that says, according to a personal interview done on March 3rd, 1997 I messed it up, let me try that again. According to a personal interview done on March 3rd, 1997 with Dr. and Dr. Shankar. And she pulls down one of her visual aid covers, and it's a picture of her parents in lab coats and stethoscopes. She says, my parents. So then, Few minutes later, she's getting near the end of her second main point and says something and says, according to a personal interview with my little sister, pulls down the visual aid cover again, and there's this 11-year-old girl in a lab coat and a stethoscope. Dr. Shankar. So then, she's maybe 30 seconds away from the end of the speech. It's the last thing she says, and she says, we can all take a hint from my little brother, and she rolls her eyes, takes the visual aid cover down, assistant night manager Ravi Shankar, and he's in a 7-Eleven uniform. He's got this big smile on his face. And he's got his arms around his two sisters and his mother and father, who are all still in their lab coats wearing their stethoscopes. And so her persona all the way through has been, she's the one who's a doctor, she's presumably very affluent, and the whole speech is about how owning things doesn't make you happy. And you get the point at the end, because the only happy person in the speech is the one who's the night manager at 7-Eleven and doesn't get paid anything. But that persona worked so well. There were so many jokes that worked better because she was so serious. I mean, the example I gave you before about her joke about the first source she cited in her speech. Recently, I was reading the Journal of the American Medical Association, which, when I'm feeling a little spunky, I like to call JAMA. That wouldn't have worked nearly as well if she was, kind of in a level mood or smiling and pleased, but the seriousness is what made it work. So, you might think, once things are coming together, is there a persona? Is there something you're going to take on that will be kind of the backdrop between every single bit in the presentation? Now, I've talked a very long time, and I've talked about some of the ingredients you can put together in taking your ramblings and looking for setup, punch, setup, punch, setup, punch. When you get to the end of this process, if it's gone well, you will have 10 to 15 minutes where you could just go setup, punch, setup, punch, setup, punch the whole time. And then the time limit on your after dinner speech is a lot shorter than that, which is a good problem to have, because you have more material than you need, which means you can just pick the best of it. Now, all along, ideally, you will have been putting together, well, not all along necessarily. Let me take a step back. When it comes to how to write a platform speech and how to generate funny material, here's my music analogy again. The music analogy is, it's like writing a song, and the time, or where in the sequence you compose the melody, and where in the sequence you write the lyrics. Which do you do first, in other words? Do you write a song by composing it? Do you write a song by writing it and then thinking up a melody to go with it? And you'll find that there are different musicians over the years who've done it different ways. I'm going to date myself by which bands I refer to, but R.E.M. and U2 and even the Beatles tended to create the melody first, and then they would come up with lyrics. As a matter of fact, there's a story where Paul McCartney had the entire melody for the song Yesterday come to him in a dream. And he had not thought of any lyrics, so he made up some placeholder lyrics just so he wouldn't forget the melody. And the placeholder lyrics were scrambled eggs, oh my darling, how I loved your legs, in place of yesterday all my troubles seem so far away. So sometimes they write the melody first. But on the other hand, Elton John he worked with a lyricist by the name of Bernie Taupin. And Taupin created all the lyrics, and Elton John composed all the music, but Taupin always went first. He would write the lyrics, and he would send them over to Elton John, and Elton John would have these lyrics in front of him and create the melody that went with them. There's also a team from the 30s and 40s and before who wrote musicals that were mostly staged on Broadway, Rodgers and Hammerstein. And Rodgers was the composer, but he didn't compose anything until Hammerstein sent him over the lyrics. And he would say, Hammerstein's lyrics are such true poetry that when I read them, they evoke something emotional in me, and that comes out as the music. And then Bob Dylan has said before, he creates them both at the same time. That he reads a lot of current events to look for ideas for lyrics, and he listens to a lot of melodies to have a lot of sound running through his head, and it's never one or the other first, it's the two together. So here's what I think. I think it is harder than it looks to take a speech and then figure out ways to make it funny. If I were you, I would start by generating my comic material. Have a critical mass of comic material, enough that you were pretty confident that you were going to be able to find enough of it to match the speech, and then do serious work on writing your platform speech on that subject. So, let's say one of the things you put down that you hate is you hate people who don't clean up after themselves. And you go off and you ramble about it, and your friends help you turn it into setup and punch, and you use some of these techniques, and you've got some good rules of three, and you've got some good callbacks and some good mimicry in there. And then you start doing your research to put together a good, respectable platform about cleaning. And you discover that in March of this year in the Wall Street Journal, there was a fairly nifty little article about the psychology of cleaning and about how cleaning products are marketed differently to different segments. There's the about 20% who get something cathartic out of cleaning. And so you market the products to them one way. Then there are the other people who are the convenience cleaners. And this could become an informative speech, or it could become a persuasive speech. We need to keep cleaner houses, or we need to lighten up a little bit on the cleanliness of our houses because they're probably clean enough already. Any of those would make fine platform speeches. You, meantime, have got the comic material you're going to braid into it. So, what I do have to say is I've always thought about writing a platform. This is to get back to my cooking analogy. I always thought of writing a platform really as kind of similar to cooking. You first of all cook with the ingredients you've got. So what I always thought was you go out and you do your research and you find the bits from the research that are going to help an audience understand what it is you're trying to say, and also are going to surprise them and shake up their thinking a little bit. You also make some notes about your own explanations, your own insights, and then, this shows how old I am, I used to put them on 3x5 cards and try to find a place with a big seminar room table where I could slide them around. And I would get them in a sequence. Sometimes you go from earliest to latest, sometimes from simplest to most complex, and sometimes you can't even say what pattern you followed. You just know that it flows. You just know that it works. And what you can do, if you've already generated a lot of your comic bits, you can have those there on your 3x5s as well. Now you, with your crazy computer stuff, you might actually have a system where you can put all those on little Post-its on your computer and move them around and get them, or on your tablet or whatever else, and get them into, have complete freedom to rearrange them until you've got them in a shape that works. But really what you can do then is you can treat the comic bits as just another form of support. Now I will say they should be a very privileged form of support, because one of the things that is going to separate after dinner speakers from one another and have some people move to the top and get the higher rankings, if someone who is judging after dinner speaking should never let their attention wander. They should never go long enough without a laugh that they start to forget the last funny thing that they heard. So there has to be a rhythm to it. You have to get them back to something that's at least worth a big smile every few seconds. It's one of the things that early stand-up comics have to learn is you don't tell long stories in stand-up, because there have to be little laughs along the way or you lose people. After dinner speaking is the same way. It's a speech, and it's a speech with a serious point. But if you are going to be competitive with the other speakers, the ones who are really skillful, you've got to have something amusing coming along often enough that people have not forgotten the last amusing thing that you said, which means that the density has to be something that's fairly high. Okay, so this has been a lot of material. What I think I would do if I were you is I would start with what your possibilities are, what your topics are, and when you have a topic that looks kind of promising and it looks like you're going to be able to do some good productive rambling, then maybe first start to survey the research and see, are you going to be able to find enough interesting and credible sources that you could put together a good platform on it, and work the two sort of together, but let the humor get out front. Let the comedy get out front, because that's the more challenging part to write. It may be that you are one of the people who have different gifts and you can write an entire platform and then only then start the process of generating your comic material, and that may work better for you. But what I have found is when you've got a whole storehouse of comic material already in your pocket, and then you do the more familiar task of constructing a platform speech and slotting in the comic material where it goes, then that's the kind of thing where you're less likely to get writer's block and get frustrated and so forth. I've got one last video's worth of material to share with you about what to do as far as after dinner speaking, and this is going to be a little different. It's not going to be a how-to, it's going to be a challenge. And it's going to be a challenge based on a lesson that I have been teaching to my communication students for the entire time I've been here. So you should stay tuned for that.